Want to know how to name a spaceship? This is the place for you. We have done a similar video before, but that was focused on the symbolism behind names. This video is instead going to be looking at naming conventions, the common patterns that occur with the names of real ships and fictional ones. But we'll also look at some other naming things too, and even do a worked example going over how we named our space carrier. There's also going to be a mongoose somewhere. Firstly, what is a naming convention? It's the general theme that goes into a particular class, type, or tier of ships. Sometimes these themes can be pretty rigidly defined and followed, and other times it can be a complete mess, mixing together all sorts of different themes on the same ship class. Generally, the more powerful a ship is, the more prestigious its name. The biggest vessels like battleships or carriers get named for monarchs, important locations, or impressive words, while smaller ones are named for lesser things.
The Boomin' Beaver.
This hierarchy can simply come from tradition or be codified into law, as was the case with many US Navy vessels. There's a great example here with the way many of their ships are named after places following an act of Congress. It set states as the highest tier, then rivers, then cities and towns. This did stick around to some degree, with battleships being named for states, which has the extra benefit of giving that state a sense of ownership over that vessel. It becomes something to be proud of and something to support. For a fictional example, we have the Systems Alliance Navy in Mass Effect, where dreadnoughts are named for mountains and cruisers for cities. The smaller frigates, like the Normandy, are named for battles, which are a similar naming convention since battles are often named for places, which can lead to a bit of confusion if both schemes are used in the same navy, as they often are. This confusion is compounded even further with the common practice of naming ships after other ships. This is done because the older vessel had a storied career, or was well liked, or just had a strong name, so reusing it as a way to pay tribute to that older ship. There's only one possible example I can use here for both reality and fiction, and that is of course Enterprise.
Oh no! It's another Enterprise!
Another very common convention is naming ships after people. As I said before, this could be after monarchs or renowned admirals. For a fictional example, we have the USSF Alan Shepard from the Lunar War, named for the first American in space. Sometimes we also see craft named for people who are only real in-universe, though this can get a bit squirrely if done poorly. In a similar vein is real life using names from antiquity, whether they're real or not. Things like Agamemnon or Cadmus. Earth Force in Babylon 5 used a lot of these, for example Agamemnon or Cadmus. This practice also extends to gods, which the Lunar War actually has a really cool example of that also ties into the lore of the setting. During the opening attack of the war, a French civilian vessel carrying 100 souls was caught by a stray shot. This became a highly publicised tragedy that the French took deeply to heart, leading to an as yet unfinished orbital superiority ship being renamed after the goddess of vengeance, Nemesis. And what Nemesis also is a cool word. There are plenty of vessels out there named for cool words, but let's be honest here, the British just do this the best. You just can't beat Dreadnought or Warspite. What makes these so cool is that they're not just cool words, they signal intent. I mean, come on, Dreadnought is just an amazing way to say fears nothing. The Empire in Star Wars is my fictional example for this naming convention due to the likes of Devastator and Executor. Also, Battlestar Galactica gets a special note because while it uses gods and mythology for Pegasus, Orion and Valkyrie, the shows were centered on a ship with a completely made-up word for its name. We're going back to Star Wars here for a sec because there's also that other thing it does with a lot of its most well-known ship names. You know what I mean, when two sometimes unrelated words are stuck together in a way that sounds almost like a code word. Millennium Falcon is fairly nonsensical, but boy does it ever sound great. Later ships that followed this precedent often ended up morphing it into adjective noun, like with Mouldy Crow, Razor Crest and Onyx Cinder. This naming convention has really become one of those things you can add to a spaceship to make it really feel Star Warsy. That or it's Thunderchild. Back to reality, and there's all the other naming schemes out there, since really you can just pick anything. There was a class of French submarines named for gemstones, and the current British Type 45s are all named after words beginning with D. Side note here, but I just love how HMS Dragon is the only Royal Navy vessel with bow art. Speaking of characterful ships of the Royal Navy, have you ever heard of HMS Zubian? This was a First World War destroyer made from the front end of HMS Zulu and the middle and rear of HMS Nubian. Zulu, Nubian, Zubian. A real-life kitbash, and potentially one that's unique? I don't know enough about history to be sure. Hit up the comments if you know of anything else that does this. After going over those common naming conventions, we're going to do that worked example I mentioned at the start before finishing up with some other miscellaneous thoughts. The ship we're using in the example is one of the ones from our Patreon rewards, the CRS Rings of Paximada, a Verlaxa class carrier. As you can see, there's two names here, so there's a whole implied naming convention. Step 1 of coming up with this convention was looking at the main inspirations and emulating them. The problem was, that inspiration was the Essex class, as many of you correctly surmised when we revealed the ship, and the Essex class has no solid theme. It's a big mix of all sorts of things, but there was a general trend of being named for battles. As said earlier, those are named for locations, which means what I really had to do was come up with place names, which I just directly stole from the huge number of Greek islands, basing that idea on the ancient Greek-derived name for the fighter that the ship carries. Paximada and Verlaxa both sound great by themselves, but I wanted to make one of them feel more spacey. To do that, I came up with some sci-fi sounding prefix words like belt or crater, and played around with combinations to find the best, which is where Rings of Paximada comes from. And I really like that name. There's a lot of other implied world building going on there that adds a sense of depth to it, and in a believable way. Which is because I have a personal gripe with ships that have overwrought poetic names that sound deeper than they really are. And yeah, I'm talking about Halo, specifically the Pillar of Autumn and In Amber Clad. I will fully admit that they are both cool names, and I'm well aware that Bungie had a history of putting in well thought out, clever lore stuff in their games. But to me, these two ships smack of being names that only sound deep. My dislike doesn't extend to all of the florid sounding Halo ships though. Forward Unto Dawn works because that's a thing that actually resonates with the game it's in, since Halo 3 is all about the end of the war. Spirit of Fire works really well too, especially since it's a Phoenix class, a converted colony ship. While we're talking about cool but less traditional ship names, I can't avoid mentioning the culture. The ships in Ian M. Banks' books are not just vessels, but also the bodies for highly advanced AI called minds, who pick their own names. Just like how real-life civilian ships can be all sorts of crazy stuff, this self-naming leads to a ton of variety and no conventions. But there are often jokes in there, like size isn't everything, which is 80 kilometers long, or frank exchange of views being a fully armed warship. Taken as a whole, the ships' names provide characterization for the minds that inhabit them, as well as the civilization of the culture as a whole. The last thing I want to mention is that all of this from today doesn't only apply to ships. Things like weapon systems can also have names rather than just designations. But with these in particular, there's also practical matters to be concerned with because there can be many of these systems, so they need to be clear and easy to understand. Like the British Rapier anti-air missile, which had the name Mongoose during development right up until someone asked, what do you call more than one mongoose? Nobody knew, so they changed the name. As I've said in the past, the real world is pretty messy. Yes, there can be nice laid out naming conventions, but there's so many other influences on ship names that the convention can often get thrown out the window, or maybe there just isn't one. So if you really get down to it, there's not really a wrong way to name your own spacecraft. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate, fighter and carrier design reference books, as well as 1 week early access to upcoming videos. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.